Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, a straight shape-shifting story in the Roman Empire. This is episode 498. I am Nobilis Reed. Our author, Nolan Vancey, is a writer from Wichita, Kansas, with a taste for fetish and fantasy. His wet and messy Regency novel, Adam's Appetite, is published by Totally Bound and is available where books are sold. You can find him on Instagram and Blue Sky, and more of his short fiction is available at patreon.com/Nolan Vancey. That link will be in the show notes. Our narrator is yours truly. Here we go. The Face of Venus by Nolan Vancey. Narrated by Nobilis Reed. Is it true that your kind can see the thoughts that men usually keep private? The warrior, despite removing his cuirass and helmet, remained on guard. The ornate cushions of the couch did not yet tempt him. A chalice of wine lay untouched where it had been poured. "Not in the way you imagine," replied the priestess. She moved closer, reading his posture, the tension and wariness in his rigid stance, and tried to put him at ease. It was her bower in which they faced each other, a private chamber within the Temple of Venus. "If you will allow me," she guided him to sit. After the warrior was settled, the priestess stepped away and returned with a small bowl of water and a cloth. She knelt before him and untied the thongs of his sandals with practiced ease. Even in the city, the accumulated dust of the streets had clung to his feet, and that she began to wipe away with the dampened cloth. In her hands, the gesture of hospitality felt more like a promise than an obligation. "Does that please you?" she said, looking not at her work but up into his eyes, meeting his gaze. "Yes," the warrior answered, the simple word covering a depth of released feeling. Himself no romantic, he could not be blind to the intimacy of the gesture. "But you still haven't answered my question." What did she expect? He had made it clear that he was not a frequent visitor to the temple. If she thought he might lose control and ravish her, she underestimated his self-discipline. Yet her eyes, expectant and inquiring, seemed to grow bigger, deeper, as he stared into them, as if he were losing himself in them, and for a fearful moment he wondered if he would, indeed, cut his visit short and commit some blasphemous indignity against the priestess without waiting for the blessing of her goddess. So he closed his eyes and gave himself over to her expert touch. "We cannot read minds," a different, lighter voice said from behind him. He jerked his head back. The woman who had greeted him had been tall, with dark eyes and hair. He hadn't noticed her finish washing his feet. The woman who now put him at his ease was shorter in stature, thicker about the hips and bosom, with rosy freckled skin and hair the color of chestnuts. "But there is much written in your body. That I can read as easily as a scroll." The warrior forced himself to relax. He must have dozed off, and if a different priestess had taken over his ministrations, he would not argue it. The servants of the goddess had their reasons, and this companion was more to his liking anyway. The priestess's skilled hands continued massaging his firm flesh. The warrior could not help but respond to the strength within her fingers, pushing and pulling their force into and out of him as if he were a vessel, a jug of wine to be diluted and poured from. Was her skin rougher than he had first imagined? He dismissed the idea. Surely it was the perfume that hung heavy among the brocaded rugs and tapestries, an incense as strong as that which pervaded the upper sanctuaries of the temple. Already feeling his mood lighten, he said, "Is that so? Tell me then, O priestess, what you read in mine." With one hand draped around his neck, the priestess circled the couch and sat upon his lap, satisfied that he would accept her closeness. Settling her pliant bottom across his muscular thighs, she nestled against his lean body, sharing his enjoyment. Only the thin cloth of his tunic and her shift separated her softness from his hardness. She examined his face, stroking the side of his cheek and the line of his jaw. The warrior had piercing blue eyes that held great distances within them, as if he were gazing across the sea. His hair was glossy black and curled into ringlets, and his strong chin and stern features bespoke noble breeding. Only the faint lines of experience engraved on his face showed that he was older than he looked. She had seen the scars on his arms immediately, and sensed their presence on the body yet concealed by cloth. She had felt as well those scars that lay deeper, in his past and in his heart. "You are a man of arms. You have known violence, both receiving it and meting it out." A sardonic curl of the man's lips answered her. That was hardly an observation that took great insight. "But," she continued, "you are not a soldier. Had Caesar announced a new campaign, the steps of the temple would be 5 deep with the recruits, eager to receive the goddess's blessing before they shipped out. Yet you are alone, and the temple steps are no more crowded than usual. Nor are you an officer, at least not any more." She met the warrior's eye, and for the first time he seemed unsure how to respond. Perhaps she had cut too deeply already, and his former wariness threatened to return. "I challenged you to tell me who I am, not who I was," he said softly. The priestess knew that when this man spoke softly it was a deadlier threat than were he to raise his voice, as surely as if he had told her, "Tell me something only the goddess would know." "You have come for the goddess's blessing, as a soldier comes before he goes off to war, but this is a private matter, a matter of honor, for you still have that, even if you no longer desire the outward trappings of glory." Suddenly she found herself sitting on the stone floor as the warrior pushed her away. "Wench, the gods have eyes and ears in many places. You could have learned who I was and repeated it back to me to dazzle me. If this is the magic of the goddess, I am not impressed." He stood as if to leave. The priestess stood as well and pushed him back down, her sore rump insignificant next to the red-hot ember of indignation that burned within her. Her full height was not terribly tall, not as tall as the dark-haired beauty who had greeted the warrior, but in an instant she visibly changed from the one to the other, from the plump chestnut to the rangy, long-limbed darkling. "Know this, O warrior," she intoned in the deeper voice he had first heard. "I am not the goddess, but her power courses through me. Do not mistake her blessing for a meaningless tryst, or me for a cheap partner of convenience." Her eyes flashed down at him. Momentarily at a loss for words, the warrior absorbed the realization that he had indeed underestimated the priestess. Part of him, too, which he could hardly hide, surprised him by responding to the sight of her rage. Her wide eyes and flaring nostrils, her flushed cheeks and heaving chest, her dominating posture. He had thought he preferred the curvaceous woman who had sat on his lap, but he could not deny the allure of this form's long limbs, her high breasts, and aura of strength. He coughed, as much to cover his arousal as to apologize. "Forgive my roughness," he mustered. "You have indeed intrigued me. I have never invoked the goddess's blessing before." For a moment she seemed to loom even larger, filling the room and threatening to touch the ceiling, and the warrior braced himself for a blow. But the moment passed like a wave beneath a ship, leaving behind only the queasiness of unsteady footing. She leaned over him, indulgent as a mother who dislikes chastising a misbehaving child. Her finger, a different tapering finger but still hers, ran along his strong jaw again. "It is well. I sense also that you have been with many women. Your expectations may be common to your sex, but I can tell that you have never taken that which was not freely given. Your honor is intact." She smiled ironically. "You need not flatter me," the warrior said, no longer menacingly soft, but petulant, as if he merely disliked being reminded of what he had lost. "There is little enough honor in what I go to do, but you are not wrong. But are you, O priestess, many women, or just 2? She sat not in his lap this time, but next to him on the couch. "I can be all things to all men through the goddess." A dizzying wave of different faces and complexions washed over her. Her features swiftly shimmered like the sands of the desert, and she became in succession a strong-featured Nubian with a skin of mahogany, a bronzed Scythian, and a milky-white lesbian. Yet through these changes her eyes held his, even as they changed color. The warrior gasped, conscious of his heart beating loudly within his chest. "That is a marvelous talent for a lover," he said, his hand reaching for and taking hers. Then his grip became a vice holding her in place. "Or an assassin," he said with sudden fervor. "Tell me the truth, wench. Are you here to kill me?" "By the goddess, no! Unhand me!" The priestess pulled against his grip in vain, though her arm became stouter and the muscles of her back and legs rippled. Thank the goddess he had not been permitted to enter her bower armed. Not only was the warrior strong with the years of hefting a sword, he knew where and how to hold his foe so that no matter how she wriggled and pushed, she escaped him not. Not the towering Goth nor the sturdy Nubian, none of her forms could pull free or push him away as she passed from one shape to another. Wordlessly they struggled, rolling back and forth on the couch, hardly the exercise the warrior had been promised, but, in its own way, just as intimate. Finally it was the dark-haired Amazon who claimed victory. With a mighty roar of anger, the priestess followed the warrior to the stone floor as she threw him down, holding him in place with her strong thighs. Her right hand she held high, poised to rake her claw-like fingernails across his face. Panting from the effort of the fight, her eyes glaring, she stared down at him. She had won by wearing him down, and he looked up at her not with fear, but with resignation. Within his eyes flickered something more. Was it admiration? "What?" she said, disconcerted by his seeming unconcern. Her hand stayed raised against him, but her resolve wavered. Finally the warrior's face broke into a grin, and he chuckled wryly. "Now this is sport. You have me in your power, but you strike not," he observed, as if merely commenting on the weather. "Truly, I believe you do not mean to kill me." The priestess's breast continued to heave with outrage, but the color drained from her face and her grip relaxed. "Do you not think I have earned the right when thus provoked in the goddess's own sanctuary?" "Aye, perhaps, but I still live. If you had intended to trap me, the moment was ripe. But I see that it has passed. Can the goddess forgive the suspicions of an old man? I have seen much treachery in my time." The priestess warily loosened the grip of her thighs and stood, offering a hand to the warrior to do the same. "I know." His natural terror of the supernatural warred with his arousal at understanding what she could do, what she could be. The desire to touch her, to possess her miraculous flesh, threatened to overpower him. The changes she had shown him were but the tease, the promise of pleasure to come. Very well, he had accepted the bait and willingly awaited the hook within his flesh. His skin burned, his cock standing rigidly at attention. "You can become anything. Anything I want?" he said, once he could speak. "Not quite," she said, flouncing away from him, now a slender brunette. The shift that had clung so alluringly to her larger frame now hung loosely from her small body, and her voice piped like the tiny frogs of the marshes. "The goddess provides what she determines you need. No more, no less. At the moment, you needed the truth." Her gaze drifted toward his erect manhood, forming a tent beneath his tunic, and she laughed lightly. "I'm glad she didn't scare you away." He shook his head, hungrier for her than he had been before. Now it was he who hoped not to scare the priestess away, and he regretted his brusque reaction to her probing. "What would the goddess have of me?" "We have only begun," the priestess said, and pulled the shift up and over her head, as she did so changing from the girlish brunette to a curvaceous, full-breasted maiden, a bit of theatricality to which the warrior responded with a chuckle and the resurgent throbbing of his cock. "Now it is your turn," she said huskily, bending over him to help remove his tunic. Her breasts swayed hypnotically in front of his face as she did so. He inhaled the musk of her body greedily and looked forward to tasting her. Soon he was as naked as she, and at last they closed the distance between them. They kissed, pressing their lips together and exploring each other's mouths with their tongues, stroking each other's bodies with their hands. She straddled him. He pressed his hips forward, his sex seeking hers, eager to unite them. But she was just out of reach, and seemingly in no hurry to finish things. His hands, seemingly of their own volition, found her ripe breasts. He savored their roundness, their smooth perfection, and her reaction to him teasing her erect nipples. Her skin became pinker, and to his delight her breasts grew larger beneath his fingers in response to his attention. Her hair changed from blonde to black to golden brown in rhythm with their petting. At the same time, her hands flowed over his lean flanks, found his hardened chest, touching and memorizing the outlines of his body, appreciating its solidity, its consistency, silently reassuring him that she needed nothing more than what he had to offer. Incredible, he murmured, almost beyond words. He had seemingly crossed that threshold already, sighing and laughing deep in her throat. She looked at him daringly in the eye, and took hold of his cock, not roughly, but with a sureness that hitched the warrior's breath, jolting him upright. It would be a shame to finish so soon, but he controlled himself, regulating his breathing and steeling himself against the temptation to erupt. She watched his reactions approvingly, enjoying the game of intimacy, leading him from one peak to another, but she sensed that he was holding something back, that he had not yet revealed all of his cards, so she was not completely surprised when he waved off the hand with which she caressed his manhood. She let go immediately, fearing she had been too rough, and laughed as if there had been a misunderstanding. "Trust me, O warrior, I would not end this too quickly." For all its firmness, his cock had only produced a tiny bead of clear liquid at its tip. He was hardly on the cusp. "Nor would I," he said, contradictory impulses warring within him. "If a man had you at home, he would never grow bored." "I must beg to differ. Even the shiniest novelties grow wearisome and are cast aside." Descending to her knees, she began caressing the base of his erect cock with her lips and tongue. Between strokes, she added, "That is why I shelter beneath the wing of the goddess. Here I am safe from the tempestuous winds of men's moods." She continued to massage him with her hands, as he seemed to prefer occupying her mouth with dialogue. "Even as you service them one after another all day? Forgive me, that was crude. But it seems the goddess both gives and takes away." "Are not all gods so? Does Mars not water his crops with the blood of the men he sends to war?" "Mars does not send men to war," he said, his breath fast and shallow with arousal. It was becoming difficult to concentrate on the conversation, as if the priestess's words came from somewhere far away. "Other men do that." "But he hears the soldiers' prayers. Does he answer them?" She kissed the wet tip of his prick in preparation for filling her mouth with it. "Some. Depends on what the man has prayed for." The warrior knew too well that not all men who went to war looked forward to coming home. He turned his mind back to the present, the bulge of his cock inside the Amazon's lean cheek filling him with rising pleasure. "Does your goddess protect all of her subsequents from heartbreak?" A thin line of gossamer liquid connected her lips to the tip of his manhood as she prepared to answer. "You know the answer to that." Her eyes narrowed as if looking right through him, and with visible effort her skin became fair. Golden ringlets of hair framed a face now heart-shaped with a narrow, pert nose and finely arched eyebrows. Her lips became full and supple, her eyes large, her breasts as smooth and overstuffed as the silken pillows that lined the couch. The warrior gasped at a memory made flesh. "But the goddess is sometimes kind," she said, in a voice that the warrior had heard many times in forgotten dreams. She rose from her knees and stood before him. "Wouldst thou return to a moment thought lost? Many ask this of the goddess. What wouldst thou say that thou couldst not then? What wouldst thou do?" The warrior, his mouth suddenly dry, the noise of his blood ringing in his ears, the thudding of his heart in his chest the only sound to compete with it, turned away at the last moment. His upright cock throbbed with need, but this was a bridge too far, a memory he did not care to relive. "No," he said, "that is not my wish. If you were to touch me with those fingers, even though it were as if years, decades had not passed, I would be lost. Even though I might eventually leave this temple, I would forever be its prisoner in my mind. For even while my body cries out to be with her whose face you wear, whose words you speak, my heart would know that it was only an illusion, and in truth, even if you were she, I could not bear to have her look upon me, upon the man I have become. It is a lovely dream, but it has been too long." Perhaps this was a mistake. He stood to leave. A hand, different from the one he had shied away from, caught at his wrist. The woman who spoke again was a stranger. "Very well. You are a hard one, O warrior. What is it you seek from the goddess? If it is only a word of blessing, you shall have it. The warrior, still shaken by the vision from his past, wavered. Finally, he returned her grip and looked into her eyes. "I would know the real you," he said softly. As you say, I have been with many women, and I would remember your face, your true face." The priestess let go of his hand as if it had burned her. Turning away with a shyness he had not seen from her before, she said, "It is not to be. The goddess told you I needed the truth. If you fear disappointing me, worry not." The priestess examined the warrior's face. His was not a kind face, but it was a sincere one. What he said, he meant. She waited for the small, still voice of the goddess within her, seeking its direction, and after a pause, made a resolution. "There are many secrets in the temple," she said. "They are safe with me," he answered. "You were right. Where I go, I will most likely not return." The priestess retreated to a corner of the chamber, between the glowing orbs shed by the candles and hanging lanterns. 2 new pinpoints of light appeared in the gloom, a pair of eyes. "My people dwelled in coastal marshes, many leagues from here," she began. "First the Persians, then the Arabs conquered the lands around us. But we lived in peace, protected by our goddess, sheltered by our obscurity. But the gods of the Romans outnumbered our goddess, and even she could not protect us from them. Caesar's legions destroyed our village and would have enslaved us. The goddess's gifts helped us escape captivity, but we were scattered, homeless. Drawn to the city, to the heart of the empire, we found that the goddess was here too, under a different name, and we sought her sanctuary. In this place, unseen, we serve her directly. You would not know me if you saw me in my people's home." "Show me," the warrior said, his mouth dry. The intensity of the glowing gaze pinned him where he stood. Had she been a viper, he could have been no more helpless. The being that stepped into the light was visibly feminine, supple and curvaceous, but like no woman he had ever seen. Her skin was a bluish-green shade that he knew from long months on the ocean, her fingers and toes webbed for swimming. The eyes that had glowed at him were large and shone orange in the candlelight, covered as they were with semi-transparent lids. They overshadowed a nose that was barely more than a pair of slit-like nostrils. In place of the hair that had turned so many colors, a cascade of fern-like fronds wove around her body, shimmering and swaying in place like seaweed, as if she were still under water. The warrior opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, not even a gasp of surprise. "So you see," the priestess said to fill the empty space, "this is not a face I show to many. The soldiers who sacked my village took us for demons, and it is only by the goddess's gifts that I escaped." After another long moment in which the warrior accepted the truth of what he saw, he answered, I would be surprised indeed to encounter you like this, without your earlier changes to prepare me. You have done me a great honor, trusting me enough to show me this." Seeing that the warrior accepted this strange form, the priestess approached him, at last closing the distance between their still nude bodies. Tenderly, gently, as if he were a wild animal that might yet prove skittish, she took his hands and stood before him, looking up into his piercing blue eyes, as this form was a few inches shorter than the man's. "Perhaps I have," she said softly, "but if so, that is a personal bestowal from me. The goddess still waits to grant her blessing." Arching her feet so that she stood up on her webbed toes, she stretched herself to reach his lips with her own. Her bosom pressed into his chest, and between her soft lips and the tiny hardening nipples of her breasts, he was surprised to find her not cold, but as warm as any other woman, and dewy soft, like the inside of a daffodil newly blossomed. "I am ready to pay my obeisance to the goddess," he said, catching her in his arms and returning her kiss. "And to you." The more he became accustomed to the marsh-dweller's form, the more he liked it. The blood surged within him as he had not felt in years. He was the explorer of an unknown territory, and the promise of experiencing something new and secret and forbidden fired his loins. His manhood, at rest since the priestess had retreated to the corner, began to fill out, projecting from between his thighs. She returned his caresses in kind, and soon enough his rampant cock strained like a hound pulling at its lead, and even with his strength he feared he would not be able to hold back. As before, had it only been half an hour, she guided him toward the couch and invited him to recline. No more smooth wine or smoother words were needed. He lay back, taking the position he thought of as the woman's, ready at last to receive what the goddess offered. The priestess climbed on top of his legs, sinuously, using her arms to lift herself, as if unaccustomed to having legs instead of a tail. Now gingerly she touched his thighs, careful not to rush the climax. The warrior opened his legs to allow her room, those piercing blue eyes never leaving her face, as if committing it to memory. Again, without using her hands, the fronds that formed her hair moved on their own, tickling the underside of the warrior's balls. It felt like the spray that accompanied the first steps into the cold surf of a morning, a tantalizing sensation he had never put into words, much less thought of asking for. The priestess grinned in her strange piscine fashion, savoring his obvious enjoyment. He was ready. The warrior arched his back, savoring the sensation of pleasure gathering in his increasingly firm root, as if every nerve in his entire body were straining to support the erection of this mighty pillar. His partner showed obvious relish for it, but was in no hurry to massage it with her hands. Instead, she rested her thighs on his, showing off her wet quim. It looked human enough, but seemed to pulse as if with a heartbeat of its own. The fronds that sprouted from her scalp like a mane swirled around them both, tickling and teasing his bare skin until every one of his tiny hairs stood on end, exquisitely held in suspension between chill and warmth. His hands found a place to rest on her hips and firm backside. He stroked both, warming to the task, and not so subtly pulling her toward him. But she still teased him, looking down at him laughingly, her wide mouth curled in amusement. Not the lips of her womanhood, but the swaying fronds took hold of his cock, wrapping about it like vines growing on the column of an abandoned temple in a jungle. Ripples of pleasure washed over him. The feeling was like being handled by his partner's long tapering fingers, but even more ineffable, more delicate. Gently, then forcefully, the tendrils wound around his manhood, feeding the throbbing of his own pulse back to him in the form of delicious, subtle vibrations. Tighter and tighter she grasped him, only the rocking of her hips on his knees suggesting that she got just as much pleasure from it as he did. Always she gazed down upon him, her large eyes narrowing with alien wantonness. She matched his gasps and moans of satisfaction with her own. Just when he thought the hardness in his cock would be constricted to bursting by her fringe, she relented, pulling back before renewing her grasp, keeping him on the edge of climax, while bringing him to ever greater heights. Finally he could take no more and pulled her to him, reversing their positions so that she lay on the couch and he clambered on top of her. The strength and solidity of the forms with which she had wrestled him to the ground were replaced by brittle lightness, more like a bird than a fish, and he was not too consumed by his hunger for her to realize how vulnerable she had made herself. Mingled with his lust was a desire to protect her from the many dangers of the world. Careful not to bruise her slender body, he lowered himself onto her. After a last appreciative glance up and down her lean torso, the juxtaposition of breasts and fins that marked her as a native of two worlds, he lowered his lips to kiss her shoulder, the vestigial gills on her neck, everywhere he could reach, while stroking and petting what remained with strong hands. She arched her back and finally, with a nod, invited him to enter her. The aroma of salt and seaweed overwhelmed him, pushing aside the incense that had yet lingered in the chamber. She was so soft, so delicate, beneath the bony surface, he was again struck by how vulnerable she was. Like an egg, he thought. He was blessed indeed to be granted access to such an easily profaned holy. Wrapping his arms around her, enveloped in the fronds that draped him along with her own tightly embracing limbs, preparing for the final shock of release, the warrior realized that if she resembled an egg, the greater, stronger shell of the temple itself protected her better than he ever could. She was safe for now, but the thought of the imperial soldiers she had described heated his blood all over. The thought of Caesar's pigs raiding her village, enslaving her and her kind, ravishing her, it was too much. If he had been there, sword in hand, she might have been spared the long march and exile she had experienced. And if those soldiers should ever seek to breach the temple, if they somehow learned who the priestesses really were, they wouldn't learn it from him, he swore, and again the urge to defend her rose within him, swelling, expanding, like a dam about to burst. priestess's alien loins roiled against his with growing excitement, until the lips of her quim pulsed deliciously against his cock, signaling her arrival and his own. "I would kill for you," he thought, and could hold himself no more. His cry of release united with hers. With a surge of elation he finished. Yes, she would be safe when he left her here. Later, after the warrior had taken his leave, the priestess likewise prepared to end her day. The transformation, just not the physical change in the act of love-making, but the searching, the reading, and the negotiation with the man's memory and desire, had challenged her. She was drained. Even had there been those rows of soldiers waiting on the temple steps that she had described, she wouldn't have wanted to provide succor to even one more man. Not today. The priestess's true form was nothing as exotic as she had told the warrior. She had become an unassuming woman, neither plain nor glamorous, neither frail nor stout, with a face that was hers alone. When she left the temple, as she did at the end of every day, she would do so safe in the knowledge that she would never be recognized. She was as good as invisible. Why did men have such fanciful needs? From his memories she had drawn a detail here, a detail there. An orchid in a swamp, a lizard on a rock in the sun, the swaying branches of an anemone beneath the surface of clear water, and above all the sensation of the surf's icy spray striking bare skin. All of these had personal significance for the warrior that she had threaded into her performance, but she doubted even he could have put their meaning into words. Perhaps only the goddess knew, and had guided the priestess to those images. Above all, as she had promised, the goddess gave the warrior what he needed to go forward, the sense of himself as a hero, a protector, and an explorer of forbidden territory. In her experience, most men found it arousing to think that they were getting away with something. After overcoming his wariness, the biggest challenge had been making her story believable, without inviting the warrior to try to liberate her. Once, as an initiate, she had played her role too well, only to find that her devotee thought himself in love, not with the goddess, but with her personally. Of course, such a thing could never be. Yet, goddess forgive her, there were moments when she was alone, when she revisited the man's gentle features, reflecting them in her own. "Does your goddess protect her worshippers from heartbreak?" the warrior had asked. Not even the gods could do that, not for everyone. She shook her head, dispensing with the unsought recollection. The warrior had been a challenge, but though tired, she did not feel cheated. The goddess had taken much from her, but in exchange she provided pleasure, variety, and, in a way, freedom. With gratitude, before leaving the bower for the night, she committed to memory the warrior's features, his touch, those memories of his that she had explored, and added them to her repertoire. Perhaps soon, or perhaps later, but eventually, one of the goddess's supplicants would find in her face something of the warrior's, a strong chin, or the little line that formed when he smiled, or eyes of piercing blue that looked as if they searched the horizon on the sea. The end. And that's our story. Remember to pick up Monster Whisperer 2nd Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website, or pick up the audiobook on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.